Hey, how you doing, man?
I'm doing all right. Can you hear me all
I
right?
can hear you excellent.
Lovely. Okay.
So I wanted to pick your brain a bit and show you a bit of Ruby code. Not that it's particularly interesting because it's Ruby, of course. More of the style and composition of it. I
Okay.
actually coded with Corey back in like 2000. It was the first Ruby conf in India, so I think 2009.
Mm.
He was on his world tour doing his thing, and I
Right.
was lucky enough to be in a cafe where he was doing some time and stole some extra time from him. And I'm not quite sure why it took me so long to pick one of his favorites. But I've read lots of stuff that you've put out there, whether it be a book form or on the internet or whatnot. And I have to say that I've been what I think about programming has been radically changed by things that you've said, things that Uncle Bob said, things that Ken Beck has said for sure. I mean, not to leave out Martin Fowler and other people, but you guys, I think I'm maybe more of an acolyte of your religion, since everybody likes to go there these days. I definitely feel that since I've gone away from state and gone towards functional and like do TDD and like make all these constraints on myself, like I give the metaphor that I'm a monk in the 15th century and I'm just flogging the shit out of myself to show my devotion. And the more I do that, like the better my code looks, the more easy it is to rationalize. The next day or next month or 2 years, I can look at it again and go, okay, there's no surprise. That's the most boring code in the world. I love that. And so I wanted to show you some, and I wanted just to
Okay.
get your opinion to see if I even have any of that right. Let's see. So I have this project. This was a peep code thing that was given to YCats and Tender Love. And what shocked me was, okay, so the idea of the thing is that GitHub has all this repository of these open source developers who do lots and lots and lots of cool stuff for free for the world, and it's awesome. So if you could build a fantasy team out of these guys, how would you get those stats and then compare those stats,
Ah, okay.
right? And so if you go to any user on GitHub and just post-pend it with .json, you get their JSON information, which is just a bunch of events, right? And these events are
Okay.
just data that just tracks what they did. It was this kind of a push, or it was this kind of a comment, or they did a fork, or they updated a Gollum page, which is actually what they call the Jekyll pages. What shocked me was that Whitecats and Tenderlove immediately typed Rails, blah, 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 blah. And to me, that just seems so strange because I really was able to do Ruby because of Rails. It wasn't like I was one of these Martin Fowler guy or Chad Fowler guys who was like, just there at the beginning. Like I came in like 2007. So I came in with Rails. Rails brought me to Ruby in many ways. Even though I found Ruby first, Ruby was not viable to me until Rails.
Right.
But even with that being said, like I have no interest in typing Rails to start a project. I want to type bundled gem and start a project. So
Okay.
let's go into some code here. Let's go into some tests here. How about that? Even better.
Sure.
So I'm a big fan of Gary Bernhardt as far as the way that tests are composed and the way that the dependencies are laid out, and I'm sure that he stole all that awesome information from people like you and other people. And so I have one integration test in this, which is so Fantasy Hub is the base part of the gem. It's the entry point to my interface. It
Okay.
has a single public method. It has a single point to my interface, and you cannot get to any of the things inside of it except through here. So as
Okay.
my only integration test in this app, currently, not that I'm against integration tests completely, VCR here is just, to make the call once, and then after that, it's just going to replay it. That way I can guarantee I get static
Yep.
information. So, oops. I have the pleasure of having a Mexican-Spanish keyboard, and it's set to English, so none of my keys match. I feel like a Dvorak guy going, why doesn't this work? Okay, so there's the integration test. It's obviously really, really simple. All I want to do is make sure that I, can parse what comes out. It comes out as an array, and I got 30 of them. And that actually happened because I slimed it. This is where I started my top-down. I slimed that to 30. Actually, slimed it to like 12 or something, and I ran the VCR. VCR recorded, told me that I got 30. Actually, no, before that, long before that, before I actually hit it, I did a 30.times.map and just returned a symbol of event. And so that's why it
Right.
started out where it started out. And then eventually the slime went away. So if we go into feed, Actually, let's actually go into the implementation here because I think the implementation is kind of cool. So I have this pattern that I use a lot. I see people reach for class all the time when they don't really need a class. They don't really want instance data. They don't really want the kinds of things that you would use a class for, having a value or some identity. This is like a singleton object. It's got a single public method. The public method name is simply there to describe what it really does. Inside of my public methods, I never ever call low-level code. It's always calling my private method so that I have control over changing my interface and how it works without like screwing with people and them consuming my API. This is the other part of my pattern is I do an alias method call to the one. I like having one public function. Most of these are functional. Very few of them actually have state. So I like having one public interface to my object, and I like to alias that to call, which then makes it follow the interface of a lambda, and it's actually kind of a lazy object. And I don't really need to know what the name of the actual function is. Like score activity feed in the context of actually working with this object is totally irrelevant because I can just type fantasy hub dot and then, or my quotes, put whatever params I got. So it passes it through, passes to score, which passes to parse, which goes down to activity feed and a UID. So it starts at the innermost and works its way out. And if you look at the privates, they're just simply wrappers for other single purpose objects that do more stuff, right? So let's go into the downloader. Actually, I'll just do it like, again, same pattern because I'm not really dealing with state here. What I have is a giant list of stuff. So for me, that tells me I want a functional approach. If I'm gonna have a giant list of shit, I wanna transform it in an immutable fashion and then spit out the results. That's really it. And then consume it with some other application that's gonna have like, what does the database say? What does the view say? I don't wanna care about any of that shit in here. This is just purely domain. So download, right? Gets a feed 4, you go into feed 4, it just cheats, uses open URI, it reads it. I simply mock this out. I do this a lot where I break everything out into, if there's a local, like this is the only kind of local that's okay. It's a local that is assigned to the return of a private method. So I'm okay with this local variable being in here. I don't like to chain long things because you can't find out like if shit in the middle broke. So I like to like have a maximum of 2 nestings or 1 nesting and a local variable. Local variables always only point to, like I said, a private. So that allows me to stub and mock at boundaries, right? So like I can change this if I really want to and get some other value, or I can just work with this one. So really, I mean, again, it's really boring code. Let's go to the parser, which really probably could have been named mapper because it's really just a mapper pattern. And again, same thing. I'm extending self, which just means that I don't have to mix this module into anything. I can just say fantasy hub feed parser.parse. I don't have to like play with some form of decoration to use my module. I love decoration when I first came to Ruby, and after metaprogramming for a few years, I learned to absolutely hate decoration and runtime alteration. So again, we just get a parse JSON, which just returns as a hash. We feed that into our transform keys. This is simply a mapper. It's just going to say, hey, look, it was in the actor key or in the repository URL key. But in the case of repository URL, the repository is actually a nil, and so you can't chain onto the URL, so I use a fetch, return a curly brace for a new hash, and then do another fetch, and then return private if it doesn't exist. So this just maps it onto what my local methods and attributes are. Again, this is just so I can mock this out. I can feed anything I want into that test time. And speaking of tests, let's get to the test on this one, and it's in feed, because it's all about the feed. It's in parser. So I have a fixture here, which is simply the JSON return from a curl. And I just store it off in fixtures. It's there. Feed is just an abstraction to read in that file fixture and present it as an actual in-memory feed. These are the kind of tests I write. So it must return a collection of events. I set parse to subject.parsefeed. And again, I could have called this like that, and it would have been perfectly legal because I'm following the Lambda interface. So, and I do that because like many times my object is so single purpose, it follows a single responsibility so well that it doesn't need a verb, it doesn't need an action, it doesn't need a method name, and you don't need to remember what that one method name was. You can remember the class name, which was what? Feed parser. You don't have to remember feed parser.parse.
Although if you were to delete that parse right now. Subject.feed, I wouldn't know.
Yeah, which is
what that
why
was about.
in the tests, I definitely never take it out, right? Because the specs are telling you what to expect. It's describing the functionality. So in here, I would never do that because that's obfuscation. However, in implementation, I might do that. And it is only a short barrier because it's a pattern that I use so much that once you see it happen, it makes sense for the rest of the time. So I don't find it too big of a technical debt for new people. And I also don't try to teach newbies this stuff. I keep them to simple stuff. Again, we're getting a actor key. We're making sure that the data actually matches what we said it was going to match. And of course, this is a very isolated test. We're only looking at the good stuff here, okay? So another thing that I follow is I don't litter my code. If you do an ACK on this, if you do an ACK on this and you actually give it something, an if, I don't have a single if statement. I never have if statements if I can help it. And so there are no if statements in here. And so there is not a lot of checking for bad shit. I expect pristine data. And if you give me non-pristine data, I'm going to blow the stack. And it's up to you to consume me appropriately because you gave me inappropriate data. That's my philosophy. I think it makes for less code and it puts the responsibility where it's supposed to be, which is the person that's giving you the data. So that's why these tests don't do a whole lot of negating on opposite. There's only one fixture at the moment. And that's because I test drove this through and it's a unit test. I don't necessarily worry about the other one because like I said, it blows the stack. We get to another one. What about, okay, so then score. This is the semi-interesting thing. Let me get to the actual implementation of score. Okay, so here's where we avoid all the if statements. This happens here. Score is just a simple map, and we're going to merge the score into a new hash and return a new hash that has the old values plus the new value, which is the event score, which doesn't exist in the information we get from GitHub. This is our interpretation. And this is where we get rid of all ifs. So we have a score by type, and we simply use, this is about the only time I use metaprogramming. I don't mind looking into the future with Ruby to metaprogram, but what I don't ever want to do is change some shit at runtime, like add a function to some class that's out there. Like that's so dangerous to me, because then you're debugging, and I dislike debugging severely. So we just call object get const, or const get, because he's not native English speaker, I think. And you get namespace, which is just Fantasy Hub events, and then the event, and then we just call score. So all this is saying is that I'm going to have an object that's going to match what GitHub said its name was, which is like push event, or pull event, or fork event, or whatever they are. And what I can do is I can actually run this over a whole bunch of different people's repositories, and every time it blows up, it's like TDD.
You're discovering a new event
exactly. I'm going to allow the blow up to tell me a new event type. So if we go over here to events, I mean, it's just a bunch of events, and they're dumb. They're just the same thing because we don't need any state, so it's just a self-existing module. It's a singleton module, and it just has a score of 2. And the nice thing about this is if Ruby was a language that had referential parency and whatnot, like, you would not actually have to have many of these on the stack. Unfortunately, you do, because Ruby doesn't have a VM right now that's smart enough. But I'm hoping that, even though I like Elixir, that eventually Ruby might actually give me something like that. And they're all just dumb objects. I could pull up any. This was the new one. I pulled up an old repo of mine that had a whole bunch of GitHub pages, and this one blew like in the middle of a show and tell on TDD I was doing. But it was awesome because it allowed me to show the audience like how easy it was to do the open-close principle here. I can insert new behavior into this construction without having any issues, and all I do is add a new class. I don't have to modify anything, because every time you touch something, you're creating churn, and you're endangering yourself of creating new bugs. And so I think like this little demonstration that I came up with in response to the Peep Code Challenge it's about as close as I think you can get to a very small example of all of the solid principles plus functional programming, immutable state, not creating a bunch of objects that you don't need, modifying strings and symbols, just the wasteful things that people do in Ruby. And I think that this makes it hard for bugs to hide. That's, I think, why I do all this.
Okay.
So can I answer any questions, and can I show you, is there any code you would like to see, or would you just like to lay on me what you gather from what I've just dumped on you?
So the just a few things I guess that come to mind. So this um, I'm not sure how I feel about this singleton module pattern.
It is the most
It's not something
controversial
that I
thing.
see. It's not something that I've seen other people do. I haven't tried it myself, and um, on the one hand, I do understand the idea of, if a module has a single entry point, then the name of the module and the name of the entry point are kind of the same thing, and so I shouldn't necessarily have to deal with both. On the other hand, though, I look at what that makes you do in your tests. The comment you made that I would never use the shorthand format in my tests. Um,
Right, that feels like a bit of a smell.
well, yeah, it feels like on the one hand, you're violating uniform access, but on the other hand, in certain contexts, it can be more convenient. So I think about, for example, uh, I can't remember if it's Apricot or Nokogiri or both, but sort of the way that you can just use a class name as though it were a constructor to slurp out an XML or an HTML document.
It's apricot, yeah.
Um, yeah, that I mean that always struck me as um,
It's kind of against
clever
the
but
flow,
jarring.
right?
It strikes me as clever but jarring, and it could just be that I'm set in my ways about how I expect to interact with raw with any bit of code in Ruby that I expect to have a class and a function. Maybe that's because I programmed in Java before I programmed in Ruby, so it could just be sort of basic dinosaur. This is the way I've always done it thinking. Um, and so certainly experimenting with other ways to provide access to your module's behaviors, um, always worth doing, and seeing when it works well and when it doesn't work well. And the only way to know when it doesn't work well is to
Do it.
you know do it and have it not work well.
Yeah. I will
Um,
say that this is about a year. I've been doing this for about a year,
yeah,
and it's in a lot of production code at everybody from Weed Maps to Cisco to you name it, right? Like this code's everywhere. It works. It is a
okay,
memory hog because it is functional. I am creating a lot of shit on the stack, and I'm just kind of letting it fall off. But then if I've got some code that's referencing one version of Bob, right, and with colors, favorite colors blue, and then I've got some other process, another core or whatever that wants to look at Bob again and changes color to green, it messes with the first process. So I don't do that. Like I have no state in my Ruby apps for that reason. They are naturally multi-core apps. I also write Java like this. I also write Elixir like this. And I think I'm totally bucking languages, except for Elixir, to do it like this. Okay, so here's where I came up with this idea. Let me give you the background. I got
go ahead.
interested in language because I've lived all over the world. I know a little bit of Dutch. I know a little bit of Spanish. I live in Mexico full time. And I was always really interested in Chinese because it's such a complex amount of data in such a tiny little character. Like, I don't use booleans in my databases, okay? I would prefer a bit. So if you want to set an admin or a role, don't ever give me an admin true in a database. That's so hackable. It's so
Right.
you've got to obfuscate the interface. So what I would rather have is some kind of a bitwise math operation on roles so that you can pack them up. And that's what Chinese
Right.
is. It's packing concepts up into a small character set. And that's where I got the idea of the modules having a single interface, using the Lambda interface to call. You're reducing the amount of information that you have to know in order to interact with the object. It started out as a total experiment, and then it kind of just like, well, on the Hangout, I gave you a link to my manifesto, which is just, these are my ideas that have come up. But yeah, I've been using it for about a year, and it's cleaned up my code. I don't have bugs. I don't have problems sleeping at all anymore. When I ship shit to people, like I feel good about it. I don't have to worry about them calling me up and being like, I need you to come back and do this for free, because I've been a consultant forever, and that just murders your bottom line. And there's always those people at the end of the year that don't want to pay because of that kind of the amount of people that have like leftover balances at the end of the year since I've started doing this kind of stuff has gone way down because there's no bugs. Because there's no bugs, I have less unhappy people that are asking me for free work all the time. So again, it comes back to the constraints that I describe in that manifesto. And it doesn't, I think, just go to Ruby. This is something I use across the board. And I'm waiting for that time when like it really hurts me. And I'm hoping it happens because then I get to learn something and change it.
Right.
Rather than just like, I hate it when you write a test and it passes right off the bat. That scares the shit out of me. I then modify it I don't modify the test, I modify the code or something, some environment to make something else happen, right? Or write another test to make something else happen.
Right, because you want some confidence that it's actually checking what you think it's checking.
It's falsifiable. Like, I'm big into science, so things have to be falsifiable. And the only thing that concerns me with this is that I haven't had a report. The only thing I get over and over is developers that are like, it's unfamiliar, so it's really weird for me.
Right.
I get that.
And I think that almost every programmer goes through this. I remember going through this exact same problem 10 years ago when I'm trying to sort of push the envelope in how I do things and experimenting with different ways of designing things, experimenting with using different idioms in the language. And as soon as you work on a team where you're doing things in an unfamiliar way, you have that ongoing negotiation of, well, I want, on the one hand, I understand that if you don't understand it, then I'm creating problems. But on the other hand, like, why don't you fucking learn something new?
Well,
so
there's two of those sides. It could be that there's a massive amount of technical debt to do that, or there could be a very tiny
but
amount.
even ignoring all that, there's always the ongoing debate of, one person feels like
the human shit.
Their job is to push the people around them to become better, and another person feels like it's their job to rein people in before they go too far.
It's the progressive conservative
and that just becomes an ongoing battle. And so that's, I think, where this is likely to create the most problem, at least in the short term, is simply in that area that people are going to say, hey, it seems like you're working awfully hard to do things differently for the sake of doing them differently.
No, for the sake of not having bugs.
Why this is so much better than a class and an instance method?
Well, that's where I get to it, because if it doesn't have state, okay, debugging is an act that you go through to find out what happened in state. If you have no state, you have no debugging. You simply have methods or functions that are given as value, possibly another function and a value, or multiple functions, and they just return a value, whether it's a function that you can call or a value. So I follow the Lisp way of code. It should be structure. Structure should be code. You should be able to stick all of that into a list and manipulate data and code like it's the same thing. Make data become code.
So let me challenge your statement a little bit there. I agree that when I've debugged in the past, one of the primary things that I've looked for is an instance where the state of a thing is not where I expect it to be. And so then what I'm trying to do is to track down what is the thing that's in this strange state. But that's only half the equation. The other half of the equation is, and how did it get there? Because let's set aside for the moment the possibility that someone gave us bad data to our entry point. Okay, I want to come back to that in a bit. But it's not just so. Yes, something's in an unexpected state. Let me figure out what thing is in an unexpected state. That's the first part. But the second part is, how did it get there?
And that's the harder one.
How did it get there always boils down to a difference of understanding of the contract of a function.
Yeah.
So it always comes down to the caller expected function to do X, function expects to do Y, X and Y don't match.
Or data
and this is the thing,
caused.
And this is the thing that I've been talking about for the better part of a decade now, which is this whole idea of we do a really good job of figuring out how things are supposed to fit together, but or documenting how we think things are supposed to fit together, but we don't seem to do a very good job of checking that each side, that the client has the right expectations and that the supplier does what they claim. And
Yeah.
so so I wouldn't say that all, and I wouldn't even necessarily say that close to all debugging problems come down to bad state
Well,
alone.
can I ask you something?
Yeah.
So, but if you have no state and no accessors, there are no writers, there is no way to modify the state because there is no state. You do
Mhm.
not have the state to find out why the state's bad, and you do not have to track down why the state got into that state. I think that's my
No,
pull
that's
to
true, but
functional
that doesn't.
programming.
No, that's true, but now, so there's a whole bunch of intermediate. State is one way to remember the effect of an intermediate calculation somewhere.
Right.
But if you have a long chain of function calls where you're not storing the state, you're not storing the state past the lifetime of the stack frame,
But
but
there's still a micro
there is
state.
still some intermediate state
Yeah.
in there. It just happens to be very transient, stuck in the stack. That doesn't mean that in your chain of 23 function calls, that function number 18 can't behave in a way that you don't expect.
Right, which is why function 18 needs to have good tests, good unit tests.
Right. So
And
right. So
it should be
if we
driven
clarify the
by those
contract,
tests.
if we clarify what we expect from every function, then that reduces the likelihood that any intermediate calculation is going to be wrong. By avoiding state, you're avoiding the sort of spooky action at a distance problem. You're avoiding the possibility where something that happened 15 seconds ago, some wrong calculation 15 seconds ago, or some wrong assumption on the part of the client 15 seconds ago, lingers. The good news is that when there's a mismatch, it's much easier to see where the mismatch probably occurred. There's fewer places to look, less of a likelihood that you write something to a database and then 2 weeks later read that from the database and oh shit, it's wrong.
Right.
So that's one thing that squeezing out all the state gives you is much more immediate cause and effect, and
Which is
easier
kind of
to
the
see
same
what
as
the cause and effect
TDD
is.
too, right? It's like a short cycle, right? Like I don't think any
Exactly.
one of these things that I prescribe or you prescribe or Uncle Bob prescribes, it does shit on its own. In fact, if you only do one, like say you just TDD, but you don't worry about dependencies and you don't worry about architecture, you'll just generate shit, right? And if you
Yes.
have two of these ideas, you probably still won't build great software. But I think when you pile the restrictions onto like
Yes.
removing state by itself, it's very arguably whether that's going to do a whole lot for you. But
Right.
if you
Removing
TDD and
state.
remove state,
Right.
and never have any object that's going to alter something from another core, I think you get rid of all of the quantum physics spookiness shit that I don't like. I'm a Newtonian. Like, I like balls that roll down planes. I like giant things that create curvature and gravity. That shit I understand. Observers, I don't understand that. It boggles me, and I don't want my code to feel like quantum mechanics. I'm not that smart. All of this comes from I'm smart enough to realize I am not that smart, and I made my life so hard in my early career. Because, dude, I was hacking at 13, right? Like, I never went to college, didn't go to high school, really. I was just a hacker from day one, which made me have a very strange mindset. It's very unscientific. It's very much brute force. And I've been programming now for 25 years, and it was literally 2 years ago that I think I stopped hurting myself, that I gave up all of those habits that just made my life hell, where I didn't sleep. I'd dream about my fucking job all night, and that's not a good place to be. So yeah, I started reading books and watching guys like you, and it made my life better.
Yeah, it's certainly one thing to be dreaming about your job when that's a pleasant dream, but not when
Yes.
not when it's dread.
Not when you're
No, I've been
worried
there.
about like what's going to happen. Because then you wake up at 6 a.m. even though you don't have to get up till 7. Because you're worried that like they already saw the problem.
It's exactly how I started. I mean, I tell the story over and over again about how why I started practicing test-driven development in the first place, and that's literally what it came down to. Was every time I
Confidence.
went home, I fooled myself into thinking I was done for the day, and every time I came in the next day, some tester told me what a shit job I did, and it just kept going and going and going, and eventually, you start to feel like no matter what I do, it's never going to be done.
Yes. Yes.
It's just
Also,
all it's always going to be hanging over my head.
before I got
So
decent at TDD, I don't think I'm great at it, but I do remember a time when I was terrible at it, and it was like trying to learn Vim from TextMate. Like it just slowed me down to a crawl to try to work
oh
in
yeah,
Vim. But now in Vim, man, I can just smoke my TextMate days, right? It's like that to me, I think. When I didn't practice TDD, I'd be in the office till 10 p.m. and it wasn't because I was playing Counter-Strike. It was because I was trying to find out what the hell is going on with this
right.
pile of mess.
All
And
you have to do is remember back to the last time that you had to stop everything, debug for 3.5 hours,
yes,
and you knew that with all this shit floating in my head right now, I can't leave until I push through to a solution here. There's no good place to stop.
yep,
I have to push through until it's done.
yes.
And if I'm here until 2, I'm here until 2.
It's that
And
brute force
that was one
hacker
of the things that I
mentality.
had to, yeah, I couldn't do that. I knew I could get away with that in my 20s, but I knew that I wasn't, that was just sending me to an early
Yeah,
grave.
it starts to hurt really quick. I agree. My other constraint I have, you'll notice maybe if you go back to my screen here, when I go to just my bash terminal, I've got 0M, 0C master on my prompt, right? That means I'm 0 minutes
Okay.
from a change in the state of the commit. So it'll stay at 0 until I alter the tree. At 10
Okay.
minutes, it turns yellow, and I make all my commits in 10 minutes. If I don't have a commit in 10 minutes,
Okay.
I'm very sad because I keep finding that I work for like 3 hours and then I have to throw away 3 hours worth of work.
Right.
And if I
Yeah, and
do
I get
10
this.
minutes at a time, and it turns red at 11 minutes. So if I see red, I commit, I get it to a place where I can commit it as quick as possible. I do a whole bunch of one-liner commits, and then when I'm ready, when my feature works, I squash them. All of the one-liner commits just become bullets, and I give it a nice commit message. Boom, I'm done. And I throw away so much less work now. I throw away 10 minutes at a time. That's not bad.
Yeah, and I think that's good to have that kind of, or to develop, not necessarily have, but to have developed
It's hard.
that kind of system.
Even now,
For
it's
me,
hard.
it's yeah. I mean, I don't always feel comfortable at the level of 10 minutes, but one thing that I have noticed is that um, my commit frequency kind of follows this curve where when I start a new task, the first commit might take 20 minutes because I'm flailing around trying to figure out what am I even trying to do.
Oh, yeah. I jump into
And
the
it might take me
REPL.
that long even just to figure out how to write the first test.
Yeah.
And I end up writing it and then not liking it and writing it again and not liking it and doing that 14
I do
times.
this. I
And
open a README. It's the first thing I create in a file. Maybe I bundle or make a gem structure, right? But the first thing I do is go into the
right.
README
Well,
and I
those are
type
easy,
out my
right? Okay.
interface, and then I go into the REPL and I can Vim inside of my REPL, right? So it's not difficult to work in ERB and change text and fuck it up and be like, oh, I got to type it all again. And I kind of like drive it out, like I spike in my REPL. And then when I kind of have an idea of what the entry point is, because the entry point's the hard point. You want to make sure that you're not too far down in the stack doing bottom up, but you also don't want to be up here in no man's land where you can't figure out how to get into this damn thing, which is where you sit at 20
Right. And
minutes.
that's often what
Yeah.
I'm doing when I'm spending that, 10,
You're
15, 20 minutes.
investigating.
I'm just bouncing around with some ideas about where the boundary is going to be, where can I get started. Once that
Okay.
first commit is gone, then the next commit might take 6 minutes, and then it starts to go quick.
Couple
Then it
tests.
starts to go
Yeah, once you
every 30
build your
seconds,
your
every
your
minute, every 2 minutes.
foundation, TDD goes really fast. But the very beginning, when
Right.
you're setting up like things like maybe Mocha or VCR, trying to figure out the entry point, that part's hard. It's just like architecture, right? When you're sitting with a blank piece of paper and you have to draw a house, it's hard.
Yeah.
But once you have a bunch of lines in place, now you have white space and you have proportion, and it's very easy to move around on your piece of paper and to draw more lines.
Right.
So, yeah.
So
It's really hot in
so
Mexico, by the way.
where in Mexico are you?
Puerto Vallarta,
Ah, okay,
my
cool. My
favorite
wife
place
and
in
I,
the world.
we got the chance, 4 years ago now. We lived in Mazatlan for 3 months,
Nice.
uh, and that was neat because we'd never been to Mexico before, and you don't really hear a lot about the Pacific
No.
coast. Usually, it's all Yucatan Peninsula, all that stuff. And we were really far south. I didn't realize how close we were to, Guatemala.
Yeah.
Um, But also, Mazatlan is lousy with Canadians.
Yeah.
They are all over the
It's like
place.
that in
It's
Vallarta too.
hilarious.
There's Canadian flags
There
all
is,
over.
it seems like all the West Coast Canadians who don't want to retire to Arizona retire to Mazatlan,
Or Vallarta.
and like there's even
You know what
a
it is? It's all a Pacific coast of Mexico. You're right. The Canadians do
yeah,
not go to the Yucatan. They go to the Pacific.
right. And so there's a bar in Mazatlan called Canucks, and it's the Canadian hangout there. And we stayed in this.
That's awesome.
We got an apartment in one of these little complexes, and there were 16 units there, and 11 of them were filled with people who had retired to somewhere in BC, and spent the winters in Mazatlan and spent the summers back in BC.
I
It
don't
was
think I have a single
trippy.
non-Hispanic friend here that is not Canadian. Most of them are well, most of them are Newfies. But yeah,
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 really
yeah.
interesting. That
And,
kind of
and you're
surprised
right.
me.
They totally have like their bars, and that's where you find them. They're all sitting in one bar, having a good time. When you walk by, and you're like, "Hey, I'll go into that bar because it's a bunch of people who look kind of like me, and they're all having a good time." And then
Yeah,
they're watching hockey, drinking fucking beer,
yeah,
and hanging out. And so I'm like, "Okay, I'm down."
yeah.
Cool.
No, it was a lot of fun. Um, so what was I going to say? So that was the thing about the modules. So I think were you? Let's,
You said something about
oh no, that's not what I wanted to do. Oops. Let me get back in there. Nope. Okay.
I'll give
I
you a new
thought I
one.
was getting back in.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I do that all the time. I'll give you a new one. And I'm going to turn on my AC and ask you if it's too loud. How's that? Do you hear a whole bunch of that?
No, almost nothing.
Okay.
All right. So go back to where we were.
Oh, sure.
I don't know if I.
Okay, so the other thing is I don't like to type, so I have, and I stole this from Gary Bernhardt too. I got this huge aliases file, and then
Yeah.
and then what I didn't steal from Gary Bernhardt, I totally stole from Ben Orenstein. So yeah,
See, I do it the other way. Instead of I don't like to type either, so I just got really good at the history command.
yeah, I do that a lot too, grepping my history and also doing a back history search.
Yeah.
The other thing is I don't type CD, so I just type the thing. So
Oh, okay.
then we do JB, and then we have the Fantasy Hub. There you go.
Okay. Yeah. So let's go back to any of the tests. Oh, you know what? There was something. Go back to where you were installing a fixture. You were using a fixture in a test.
Yes.
That's probably right at the
So
top.
the cassettes are here and the fixtures here.
Yeah.
So the cassettes are used by the one integration test, which is the test for the entry point. The rest of them are
Right.
unit
So I think
tests.
go back. Yeah.
So
Let's go
that
back
would
there.
be in. Well, downloader uses it.
That was just the Fantasy
No,
Hub
not
test, right?
downloader.
No, it was in the parser maybe.
Yeah. What are you doing? Tmux seems to eat my commands. Parser test.
Yes.
Yeah, there's the.
So, I do have control. So, this right here, I'm totally not okay with with this going up a level in the.
So would you say that
directory.
I should drop that on the load path, the fixtures on the test load path, so I could just say require test fixtures?
So me being not a Ruby, I mean I'm a I can.
I don't
can
think it
speak
matters
Ruby, but I
what
don't know a lot
language
of
you do.
Ruby
You're a
industrial
programmer, you're not.
So for me, that's where I went with that is I do not want. I mean, I just know that going up a
Oh.
directory can fail.
You're talking about artifact management. You want the artifact as close to the test as possible.
Not necessarily, but I don't want, like I said, so very practically speaking.
So this
I know
just
that
feels
going
like
up
it's breaking
Going up
something?
a directory can fail because when I move stuff around now, There's no guarantee that this directory and that directory are going to be the same relative distance from each other.
Mm-hmm.
So I would definitely want to do whatever it took to get rid of those, up the
Well,
directories.
the way to get rid of them would be to
So
put the fixture closer to the test. So if the fixture actually lived in the same directory as the test and
that's
moved
one
around
possibility.
so that the
Right.
artifact and the fixture moved, or the artifact and the test moved together, then yeah, that would remove those.
Right. So in the Java days, I always used to load this stuff using a class loader, so that in the very worst case, I just have to put it on the class path somewhere.
Okay. So that would be
So
like
that
dropping it
it's
on the load path for
putting on the load
Ruby.
path exactly.
Okay.
But then I wouldn't want the test to add something to the load path. What I'd rather have is the test say, I need this thing, and have whoever runs the tests to set up the load path.
Okay, yeah. Because I don't actually run my. I'm going to say something very heretical here. I don't use Rake. Rake reloads my environment over and over. I proved it many times.
Either, so.
So let me actually get to a real Ruby. This is how I run my tests. So I write my own Ruby bootstrapper because I typically have Rails tests that are slow as dirt, and then I have my fast tests. And so this is the script that actually will decide between the two. And so here is where you're saying put the load path. That way it doesn't affect the application implementation.
Right, and then this is an exact example of what I have been talking about for years with the whole dependency inversion principle thing. So I keep saying, when there's an unhealthy dependency, like there is in that test right now, where it depends on the knowledge of the structure of the container, which is the project in this case, that I want to push that dependency up one level of the call stack. So in this case, up one level of the call stack means I want to say I'm using these fixtures, and whoever calls me is responsible for putting those fixtures in the right place. Now that either means that, and that's the beautiful thing, there's two possibilities there at least, one of which is the one you mentioned. I can just move the fixtures into this directory.
Or even like go to the bottom here and do a end, and like stick them down like metadata in the test, but way underneath the fold where it's not going to be in your way.
Them, exactly. I could inline them and make them not stuff I have to load. That's another way to do it. And certainly, using things like __ file could be helpful. But I think, what was I going to say? So at least that's better. At least the fact that you're saying expand this path relative to the current working directory sucks less.
Which is why I didn't want it on my load path. I wasn't thinking of like do it from the runner. I was thinking of like, sticking on the load path, and I didn't like that pollution. And so I figured, and I also don't like require relatives. I don't know why, I just don't like them.
Oh no, same for me. I
hate them.
These all seem to me to be hacks.
Yes.
For not admitting that what you're trying to do is that the what do you call it? That the thing inside the box wants to know what's happening at the boxes.
Yes.
This is the thing that I tweeted yesterday, I think, right? The number one problem with the way, the number one dependency problem solver is simply to say frameworks use your shit uses libraries, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people have the order wrong. They're pointing the wrong way all the time.
Well, they do the service locator thing, where I call it the 2-year-old anti-pattern, and that's just gimme. I know where all the shit lives that I want to use. Just let me get it. And that's what makes people turn everything into a singleton.
Yeah. I feel the same about stub any instance and stub chain. Like those to me are just like I don't know where any of this shit is, so I'm just going to stub chain.
Yeah, exactly. So that's another symptom of the same problem, where you know more than is healthy to know about the world around you. So instead, the whole point of dependency injection is to say, look, here's what I need. It's my caller's responsibility to wire shit together. That way, my production client can do what makes sense for production, and every other client can reuse me in some kind of isolation.
Right.
And if you can't figure out how to reuse me in some kind of isolation, that just tells me that the abstraction boundaries need a little bit of work. But
Yes.
at a minimum, it means that the tests can wire stuff together in whatever convenient way they want. And you have part of that here by saying, well, actually, no, I'll back that out. But yeah, so as I was saying, the pushing the dependency up the call stack either comes down to remove the need for knowledge that there's a directory structure out there by just putting the fixtures in the same folder. That papers over the problem acceptably, but doesn't really solve it.
It's a Band-Aid.
To me, yeah.
Because somebody might move one and not the other, and then you're back to the exact same place.
I would at least want to leave behind a comment that says, I assume blah, 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 blah. Because again, for me as an outsider to know where's the right place to put the fixtures, I have to look inside the code to figure out where is the right place to put the fixtures. Or I can simply say, look, man, this stuff is gonna be available to me, and so if I'm just gonna say,
actually a constant in the loader that exposes its constant down that says this is the fixture's path would be ideal, right? Because then you don't actually have to have any of that system information to create a new fixture or to use one.
Using the load path, again, slightly papers over the problem because it says, look, putting something on the load path really boils down to saying, look, I don't give a shit where this comes from. I just know that there's this master directory where I can put shit.
Which sounds very scary to me.
It's better because at least the tests don't have to know how to wire all that stuff together, and different clients can wire things together differently. But yes, I would prefer even better to say, here's a configuration variable that says, here's where my fixtures are, exactly, fixture path. And then I can I can make that an RSpec configuration variable. I can make that a mini test configuration variable, whatever.
So this would probably be right here. We're going to be base, so then it's just test. What do we have? Test fixtures. And that's it. I'm the world's worst typist, which is also why I alias everything. I kind of code by approximation. If I keep typing the wrong key, I just alias the key to the right place. The other thing that I was going to comment on, I find that frame of thought fits the imperative versus functional argument really well. Because when you have objects that are always so damn concerned about the implementation of shit they should have no business of, it feels like imperative programming to me, whereas functional programming are a bunch of black boxes that just feed into each other, and they don't have any knowledge about the other side on each of them.
Right, and so part of my overall philosophy is to know as little as possible. And so there's two basic ways to know as little as possible. And this, my Beyond Mock Objects article from last year, I wish, it's funny. Now that I'm saying this so clearly, it becomes so obvious. So now I'm going to rush and add some text to that article. But it really boils down to there's two basic ways to avoid knowing shit. One basic way is to reduce the surface of integration, right? To make it so that if I'm going to use you, I'm going to know as little about you as possible.
Right.
That's abstraction. That's interfaces. That's modules. That's
design.
APIs, whatever. The other way is to say, I'm going to make it somebody else's problem. And usually the way that I make it somebody else's problem is I make it my caller's problem. And I say, look, I don't care where I need to use this thing, and I don't care where this thing comes from.
That totally makes this irrelevant, by the way, which I love. That totally removed a need for an extra. Oops. Oh, this is where teammate kills me. T-Mux, it makes me get rid of my default registers.
Ah. All right, so show me where you're going here.
Oh, it did it to me again. Okay, I'm just going to cheat. This is very embarrassing.
That's okay. Go slow to go fast.
Yeah. Whoops. Okay, now I'll get it back in my register. So my point was is that I had to break this up because originally it was too long. And it was too long because of the whole require blah, 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 file blah, 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 right?
Mm-hmm.
But now it's gone. I don't have to worry
Now,
about that intermediary. Wait, let me see what I had originally.
Was that a read before?
It should have been a read. Yeah, it was a file read. So
yeah.
What I really need is from here back to there.
Can't you do inside?
Oh shit! Like I said, I'm not a master of Vim yet, but it's a lot.
No, that's okay. Actually, you know what? Undo. Let's just do it.
Okay.
Undo.
So yeah, sure. Let's get some muscle memory. Okay.
So as far as I know, we can just go anywhere in here. Whoops.
And just do change inside.
Let me drive for a second.
CI.
And I'm gonna be non-destructive, so I'm gonna go yank a quotation mark.
Yank a quotation.
And then I'm gonna go here to fixture.
Uh-huh.
And I'm going to do the Vim trick, which is I'm going to say visual up to the parenthesis, so that when I paste... Oh, why?
Tmux killed you. Tmux eats the registers. So Apple
so
works with a default
register.
register.
So let me try
you have to do
then.
a register. Yeah, it always kills me. I'm lazy and I don't put a register in.
Yeah, so now... I did inside instead of and. Okay, so let's try this again.
So
up
it's
here,
CI instead of CA, right?
Right, so I'll yank a quotation mark. Oh, Christ. In register A, yank a quotation mark. Go to fixture. Select everything inside.
Fixture.
No, undo. Register A, paste. I've lost my thing. Register A, paste.
Yay! And we'll just
go back and find a space. Get rid of it.
Sorry, too many drivers. Yes,
no
and now
problem.
that can go away, and then we can just
All
run
right.
our tests. Well, let me make sure it was saved. I didn't pay attention to that. And yes, our test still passed, which is why I love fucking having tests. And here's the thing, like my biggest argument where people's like, don't TDD, tests are fine. It doesn't matter when you make the test. You could write the code today and write the test in a year, whatever, as long as you have perfect coverage in the end. But my argument is you will never have perfect coverage doing it that way. Your code will be designed so terribly, it's impossible to test it without doing a complete refactor. So why do that?
Yeah, I used to have a guy who worked with me at IBM, and he had exactly that same argument. He and I shared an office for a year, and he, it was at the perfect time of my career where I was really acting the part of the XP zealot, and he was challenging me at every turn, which was good because
giving you all your material.
It helped. Well, it helped me refine a lot of my arguments, and he had a way of calling me on my bullshit in a way that made me feel like he was on my side.
Oh,
and
that's so awesome.
So he would say, okay, well, Joe, I don't understand. If my cycles are small enough, why does it matter whether I write the tests first or after? Let's imagine that my cycles are measured in 15, 30 seconds. Let's even imagine that, I write the line of code, then I write the tests, then I write another line of code, then I write the tests. Why, what's the difference? And it took me several years to have any kind of answer, because that stopped me cold. That comment always stopped me cold. I had no idea, and I just kind of thought, yeah, it feels like I'm right, but I can't justify
your
it yet.
intuition told you there was something there, but you didn't have the
Exactly,
logic.
but I couldn't articulate what it was, and it wasn't until I was doing a session, a little open space session actually at XP Agile Universe 2004, and so yeah, this was now 4.5 or so years later, and I had somebody ask me this question, and it just came to me as if in a vision.
Your brain was working it out.
Have you ever been in a situation where you've written some code and then you tried to write tests and you had trouble writing that test because you weren't sure what the code was supposed to do. You didn't know how to articulate what the right answer was supposed to be, or when you tried to articulate the right answer, it was really complicated.
Mm-hmm.
He said, yeah, I had that happen. I said, okay, well, can you estimate how often that happens? He says, oh, maybe about 20% of the time. So I said, okay. So I, drew a little diagram showing, hey, write the code, write the test, and fine. Have you ever had the experience of writing some code and then when you try to write the test, you find it really difficult to write the test? Like you have to do a whole bunch of setup in order to make the test run at all, or you have to, lift up the covers and fiddle around with some of the wires and put data in this table and clobber that properties file in order to be able to put stuff in the right place so that your test would pick up your data. Yeah, I've had that. Okay, so how often would you say that happened? He said, yeah, around 20% of the time. I said, okay. So I drew the little diagram.
Now we're
of
at
the
40,
feedback.
right?
So I said, now, what do you do? So when it happens that you can't figure out how to write the test because you have to move wires around and put stuff in property files, blah, blah, blah. Well, I have to make a decision whether I want to change the design so that I can inject that stuff more directly, or I have to resort to these, sledgehammer tactics of, you know, hide the properties file, write a new one in its place, run the test, and then put the real properties file back in its place, or, truncate the
Astronaut
table, put some
management.
data in, all that kind of stuff, all the fixture-y kind of stuff that
Yeah.
we often have.
Change
But
the
yeah,
whole
it's-
world so you can make one assertion.
Exactly. I said, do you ever find that kind of annoying? Yeah, I think it kind of sucks. I said, yeah, I agree, it kind of sucks. Now, what happens when you're not sure, when you have trouble articulating what the right answer should be? What do you end up doing? He said, well, now I have a choice. I have to do a whole bunch of tedious shit, like maybe I end up creating a little file format so that I can express the data more compactly, but then I have to write my own little parser for it.
Then you gotta write
Or I end
tests
up
for
having to
your
break.
shit.
Right, exactly. Or I end up having to, or I just end up having to split the functions into smaller functions that operate on smaller bits of data so that
Which is always good.
I can test little parts of it at a time and feel more confident that when I put the parts together, they'll just work. I said, yeah, you know what? I do exactly the same thing. Now here's the difference. When I test drive, I don't get into either of those messes.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen.
It's guardrails. That's what all these things, all these constraints I put on myself, they're just guardrails. I don't want to fall off the cliff.
So when I test drive, it's to me, like someone else will look at a bunch of the stuff that you've shown me here and say, that guy's fucking crazy. Because some of
I
it
am a
is-
little crazy.
Right. Some of it's crazy. There's no question. But, and I do some shit that people find crazy too. Like the number of times that people have called me the refactoring Nazi, the number of times that I go to commit, a 4-character change and sweat for 15 seconds about what the commit comment should be. There's things that
Because it
people seem to do.
matters. That context fucking matters. It's important.
So I'm going to stop you there. That right there, that's go deeper. It's not that matters. It's I know what kinds of mistakes I make, and I've created systems to help me either make the mistake less frequently or
prevent you from doing it.
make the mistake cost less. And so when I commit 40 times an hour, I do that because I know that if I'm left to my own devices, I'm going to go and I'm going to write code for an hour and a half, and I'm going to get something working and then go, yeah, cool, let's do the next thing. And then I'm going to get something else working and go, yeah, cool, let's build the next thing. And I'm going to get 5 things deep. And then I'm going to end up in the jungle. And then I'm going to be wandering around for days trying to figure out how to get my way back. And I won't want to throw all that work away because I don't want to throw away the 5 cool things I did just because the 6th one didn't work. So after doing that a handful, 20, 50, 170 times, that's when I realized, I need to check in more frequently, not because I give a shit about other people, not because it's the right thing to do, not because Ron Jeffries told me it was a good idea, but because
It's for me.
if I don't, then I'm going to have to throw away 3 hours of work instead of throwing away 10 minutes of work. Or 20 minutes.
I'm a very selfish
or worse,
man.
I'm going to force myself to push through and now I'm staying in the office until 2 in the morning to try to get it to work, or going home when I'm exhausted.
Which is an ego trip at that point. You're like, I can't give
Absolutely.
up because I have to
Oh
win.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So for me, it does. Saying that shit matters
But to
is
me
even
it
meaningless to
does.
me.
But for
What it
me
is?
it does because it matters because I've
Oh,
hurt myself with stupid commits that didn't give me any context.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So when you say it matters to me in these situations for these reasons, yeah, you've got me on the hook there. But I find that a lot of the things that go on in the in the software community, a lot of the drama we have really boils down to forgetting to say "to me" at the end of that
Yeah.
sentence, because it
I
matters
think
to
we
me.
try to Twitterize everything, and I fucking hate Twitter for I mean, it's a great communication thing, right? But everybody always misreads you every single time because there's no facial recognition, there's no eye
I
expression,
agree.
there's no cheek
And I,
movement.
I like it precisely for that reason, because it
It
encourages
causes
me
fights.
to really pay attention to what I'm saying.
Oh, well, that's
And I
true.
find it
Makes you
I find
refine
it
it.
to be a cool I find it to be a cool I find it to be a good, cheap way to learn to be concise, and to learn to be precise, and to learn to think about what I'm saying, and not just blah, 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 right? Almost every problem I have on Twitter boils down to I hit enter before I was ready. But that's the same whether it's in a mailing list, in a Yahoo
An
group, in
email.
Usenet,
Yeah.
or when you're, standing on the street corner screaming at people. It's the same.
Do you keep stats on shit or just kind of in your head? Like of your activities and how many times things failed? I know Zed Shaw keeps stats on his stuff, and I kind of keep some stats.
I don't keep stats. I've never found a system that allows me to track that stuff unobtrusively. I haven't tried much, mind you. I'm intrigued by some of the systems that people have put in place to do that. And the closest I've ever come was I played around with Industrial Logic's sessions plugin for Eclipse, where it's essentially records everything you do and gives you back
Oh.
stats like you spent this much time on a red bar, this much time on a green bar, this much time with compile errors. It tracks how many times you attempted an automated refactoring on a green bar compared to a red bar, things like that. And I found that kind of interesting. I played with that for about a year, and then I didn't. Then I stopped doing Java frequently, and that nobody has that for Vim and Ruby, so I don't have that
You
information
know, I do. I
anymore.
just have a SQLite database, and my history, the results of my commands, I have matchers that match. It makes my IDE sometimes, or my console slow sometimes, I'll admit, but it's matching
Right,
stuff. And when it sees things like failed tests, it just says, hey, this project got a failed test, this project got a failed
right.
test. And it kind of gives me a gauge of if I'm improving my craftsmanship or if I'm just like, failing shit all the time.
Yeah, for me, I really, to answer your original question, I really do let it be more impressions, which I know,
It's all
has
thing.
me fall prey to cognitive biases all over the place. But um, I, I just sort of have, I go with, often the bottleneck for me in my productivity is how I'm feeling. And so if what I'm doing feels good, then it's probably going to allow me to get out of my own way more, and stuff will just tend to flow more. Um,
You
and
sound
I
like a
also
very
sort of,
intuition-based guy. I mean, not.
yeah, and
I'm sure you're
I also rely on,
scientific, but I think for your own self, you're very intuition-based.
right, and for, I also go by the heuristic of, um, the more surprised I am, the more things might be going wrong. So I like to get on a roll and have stuff be very routine, and then every so often be tweaked by something unusual. But if I feel like if I'm surprised a whole bunch of times in a row, that's the time to get away from the keyboard and talk to somebody.
The last thing I will say on this call for this part is I'd like to play pool. I call my shots. My
Yeah,
code's going to fail for this reason. This is going to
same for
happen.
me.
And then when it doesn't happen, I'm like, okay, my understanding of the world around me is wrong. It's time for some
Absolutely.
math because I have to go to numbers to verify it.
So yeah, I end up saying this in almost every training course I do. I say, I before, I learned from Kent Beck the trick of before you run the tests, just say, even aloud, pass or fail. Just even that is enough. And every so often I run the tests and I say pass and they fail, or I say fail and they pass. And either way, that's useful information.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, one of the tricks I learned from Kent, if I say pass and the test fails, I don't even look at what I did. I undo and I try again. And
I
I
don't
run it a
look at
second
error
time.
messages on fails a lot of the time. I just revert.
Right. And I try it a second time. And if it happens a second time, I do it one more time, undo and try it again. If the third time I try to run the tests and they fail, then it's time to get it's time to get up and walk away from the keyboard because I'm too stupid to program right now.
I just wrote that down.
Now, here's the next part. So even more than that. So I get up, I shake my head, I start and I decide, okay, time for coffee, whatever. I walk the 4 feet to the door. I put my hand on the doorknob. I twist the doorknob. And 8 out of 10 times, what happens? I go, oh shit, now I know what I was supposed to do. And it all falls into place, and I see exactly what I was doing wrong and exactly what I should do right. The trick at this point is to keep walking.
Mm-hmm. To not
Is
just
to actually
go back
take the
and
break.
be a
Don't
cowboy.
just go back and try it, because all you're going to do is 20 minutes later be in the same situation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I say, good, now I know what I'm supposed to do. Keep going, make the coffee, chat with somebody, come back, it'll still be there. And when I started doing that, just the number of deep, deep holes I got myself into went way down.
Awesome.
I just,
I can see
now
that.
I make a lot less expensive mistakes now than I used to.
They're expensive when we work. That's what I think
Yep.
a lot of people don't have an appreciation for is money. I was homeless at one point when I was young. Like, I was hungry. Money's hard to come by for some people.
Yep.
And the values, man, that shit's inflated. You don't get a whole lot for much. So, yeah, our mistakes are costly. And we
Yep.
and not just that, what if you're making medical equipment like I've made before? Like my bugs, I felt terrible about those. I mean, somebody's doing altitude training and it's not reading their shit right and the doctor pushes them too hard and they die. Come on, that's my fault. Which is why I stopped making that software.
I won't work on life critical software for
Yeah.
exactly that reason. I don't trust myself to do it well enough. And if every single day I wake up, if I think about how bad most software is, then I would never put money in a bank. I would never get on a plane. My life would be over. So
That's
I have
why
to
I live in Mexico.
I have to pretend that stuff that doesn't exist. I have to shut that part of my brain off, otherwise I couldn't live.
Awesome. Hey, Joe, thank you so much. I really want to do this again.
welcome.
I'd like to maybe even get time once a week or once every other week with you. That's really awesome.
All right. Well, feel
I'll
free to
keep
book
booking you.
anytime, and yeah.
Thank you. And if at any point some other thing comes in your consciousness about the crazy shit that I write, feel free to contact me. You can bug me anytime you like.
No problem. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Joe.
All right. Take care.